Plutarch's Lives from Omnibus 4. All right, we have time for just one more question for Mr. James. You can have one last chance to ask your favorite athlete a question as the Q&A time comes to a close, if only he will pick you. Yes, sir, in the blue shirt. It's you. What question will you ask as you stand face to face with your favorite celebrity? You. Mr. James, there's one question that I've been dying to ask. Mr. James, sure, kid. Ask me whatever you want. You. Okay, Mr. James, here it is. What did you do when your dog wet the carpet last week? Mr. James. What? Odds are this would not be the question that we would ask. There's a dog. This would not be the question that we would ask. At least, I hope not. If we were talking to our favorite athlete or the presidents of the United States or anyone important. You might not ask questions like this, but Plutarch would. He wanted the story behind the story. He wanted to see the character of the people he was writing about with crystal clarity. Our reactions in small matters reveal our character. It matters if Mr. James cleaned up after his pooch and perhaps looked up a dog trainer on the internet rather than electrocuting his dog or setting him on fire. Goodness. In the same way, Plutarch was not just interested in all the grand accomplishments of a man's life. In his lives, Plutarch is more concerned to uncover the character of the men he writes about than their public accomplishments. And this leads him to ask different questions and relate different episodes of the lives he writes about than a historian might consider most important. General information. Author and context. Although we know few details about Plutarch's life with certainty, we do have a decent outline of his biography. He was born during the reign of Claudius, probably around AD 45. His parents were Greeks who lived in a small town in Boeotia called Chaeronea. Plutarch grew up in the city and, after a life of study and travel, retired to the same town to write his lives. Plutarch spent his youth studying philosophy and eventually opened his own school. Unlike many of his Roman contemporaries, he rejected Stoicism and Epicureanism in favor of following the doctrines of Plato. And unlike many of his contemporaries, his writings are in Greek rather than Latin. Plutarch wrote a number of different essays and dialogues about philosophy, but it is his parallel lives that have been enjoyed for nearly 2,000 years. He traveled widely during his life, visiting Greece, Asia Minor, Egypt, and Italy. His travels furnished him with a wealth of information that found its way into his writings. Plutarch had the privilege of living his entire life under the Pax Romana, the extended period of peace and prosperity that lasted from the reign of Augustus through much of the 2nd century. His travels, as well as his writings, demonstrate the peace and unity that existed throughout the Mediterranean world during his life. At home, Plutarch was married to a woman named Timoxena and had at least 5 children. He also served in a number of public roles, including Commissioner of Public Buildings and City Magistrate. Later in life, he was appointed Procurator of Greece by the Emperor Hadrian and served as a priest of Apollo at Delphi, I think. Plutarch died somewhere around AD 120, while Hadrian was emperor in Rome. Significance. Plutarch has been called the first modern biographer, an indication of the novelty of his approach among ancient writers. There were other authors who had been historians, such as Herodotus or Thucydides, And there were certainly other authors who had traced the events of other men's lives. But Plutarch's approach was new. In his efforts to relate the lives of the most important men of Greece and Rome, Plutarch sought to communicate more than just history. He went beyond merely relating events or rehearsing battle details. Plutarch was concerned about understanding the character, motivations, and morality of these men. As Plutarch himself put it, "My purpose is not to write histories, but lives." Plutarch, therefore, stands out because of what he attempted to accomplish with his writing. Perhaps because Plutarch has been considered the founder of a literary genre, his work has also influenced later authors, particularly in the last few centuries. The fact that the most widely used translation was by John Dryden, a well-known British neoclassical author who opposed the onslaught of French Enlightenment thinking and the deism that often accompanied it. Dryden's interest in Plutarch is one indicator of the importance attached to Plutarch's work in the 17th and 18th centuries. Plutarch also influenced some of Shakespeare's most famous works, including Julius Caesar and Antony and Cleopatra. If one compares Shakespeare's play about Julius Caesar with Plutarch's work, he will notice that Shakespeare has taken many of the names and details directly from Plutarch's account. In other words, Plutarch not only introduced a literary genre, but he also provided inspiration and information for important literary works hundreds and even thousands of years after him. Main characters and summary. In biographies, the main characters are not just the most important figures in the story or the character with the most lines. The main characters are the story. Our selections include the lives of Alexander the Great and Julius Caesar. Alexander the Great, son of Philip of Macedon, was hungry for glory and great accomplishments from his youth. Plutarch notes that he would shed tears at his father's military success, saying his father had deprived him of a chance for glory. But Alexander had plenty of opportunities to achieve glory, for upon becoming king at age 20, he immediately began his march through Greece, Asia Minor, Persia, and India, establishing the greatest empire up to that point in Western history. Caesar was also eager for honor, and he was said to cry when thinking about Alexander, who had accomplished so much more than he had at a comparable age. Caesar survived the civil war between Marius and Sulla and led Rome as a part of the first triumvirate with Pompey and Crassus. But after the death of Crassus, Caesar turned on Pompey and defeated him, becoming master of the Roman world. Alexander and Caesar both transformed the Western world socially, politically, and militarily. The ancient world was overturned in 10 days. The ancient world was overturned in 10 years by the young Alexander, who changed the map, introduced a common language, spread Greek learning, and reached the height of military accomplishments by the age of 30. The Roman world may never have become an empire had it not been for the ambition and success of Caesar. He set the stage for the greatest empire the Western world has known. Thus, as Plutarch puts it, it is nearly impossible to summarize the great actions and monumental impact these two men had on ancient history. World view. Bottom of the ninth inning, 1 out, Game 4 of the American League Division Series. With my favorite team 2 outs away from ending its season and each member heading to his living room instead of the league championship series, 2 men reached base. The crowd went wild, every single fan standing on his feet and jumping up and down. However, as a small child, all of 32 inches tall, the packed mass of people made it impossible for me to see what was happening. There I was, fulfilling my childhood dream of attending a playoff baseball game. and I couldn't even see the action as my team was about to win the game in the last inning. Fortunately, Dad came to the rescue. He hoisted me onto his shoulders so that I could see what was happening and understand the joy of the fans around me. Do you still remember sitting on your father's shoulders as a small child in order to see over a large crowd? Perhaps it was at a parade or a speech by the president or a baseball game. The crowd around you makes it impossible to see what's going on. Of course, once a father lifts his son or daughter up, the child is able to see even farther than the father. Those of us who live in the 21st century are somewhat like that small child climbing in order to see things more clearly. We are on the shoulders of those who have gone before us in history. Their thoughts and writings help us understand who we are and where we are headed, while their lives offer us examples of how we ought and ought not to live. But what if every generation ignored the men and women who lived before it and tried to do everything new? Would we have computers or even electricity if inventors didn't learn from those who experimented before them? And how much would we understand about medicine, surgery, or the human body if every doctor tried to figure things out for himself without considering the research of men who went before him? But we would also lack a tremendous amount of wisdom about life if we ignored those who have lived, thought, and written about their experiences. Unfortunately, many in our culture have adopted what might be called massive chronological snobbery syndrome, or MCSS, massive chronological snobbery syndrome. Chronological snobbery is a logical fallacy that assumes older ideas are less important, less applicable, or untrue just because they're old. While enjoying newer technology is one thing, when our culture begins to reject the wisdom of past generations as well as its technology, then each new generation becomes more and more impoverished intellectually, morally, and spiritually. Our culture seems to believe that previous generations are not worth listening to because they don't understand, aren't living in our age, or are out of touch with the world today. But this attitude ignores the fact that human nature does not change. The experiences of past generations render them very capable of offering wisdom and truth to each new generation. I once knew a small child who was fascinated with fire. The dancing flames tantalized the young boy, and despite his parents' continued warnings, he did not listen. Philip II of Macedon had just been victorious in a battle when he received 3 messages at once. One of his generals had defeated an enemy, his racehorse had won in the Olympics, and his son Alexander had just been born. The seers assured him that a son whose birth coincided with these 3 successes could not help but be invincible. Once knew a small boy, fascinated with fire, who did not listen to their advice until he had burned his finger in a candle. Although a teenager might consider himself infinitely wiser than the young boy, his complaint that his old man was stuck 40 years back in history and didn't understand that now it's okay to do what everyone else in high school was doing follows the same foolishness as the boy sticking his finger into the fire. When children reject the wisdom and advice of their parents, they are not just rejecting a God-given authority, they are also rejecting a store of wisdom and guidance that God has built into the structure of our lives. In the Bible, this store of generational wisdom appears in God's covenant with Israel as well. A covenant is something that builds from one generation to another. While each new generation renews or reaffirms a covenant, a proper understanding of the terms of the covenant and the motivation to keep the covenant in obedience come from looking back at those who have lived previously. When God spoke to Israel, he didn't come up with a new contract. He turned back to the covenant of their fathers, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Israel's understanding of who they were, where they were headed, and how they ought to live came from looking back at those who had gone before them. This is also why God commands parents to teach God's commandments to their children and to pass down the stories of his great mercy and salvation. Wisdom is multi-generational. When Israel stopped looking back to the covenant with their forefathers and started to do what was right in their own eyes, the chaos, immorality, and judgment of the period described in Judges resulted. Biblically speaking, only life in covenant with God, which inherently rests on the examples, promises, and wisdom of previous generations, yields obedience and blessing. In his Lives, Plutarch is self-consciously recording the moral examples of men from the past so that future generations might learn from their successes and failures. As he put it, his goal was to arouse the spirit of emulation in order to inspire men to imitate the moral exemplars of the past, while at the same time offering clear lessons on the vices, temptations, and mistakes men have made in history. In his attempt to inspire us with moral examples, Plutarch is doing something profoundly biblical. God's word repeatedly urges us to pay attention to the lives of those who have gone before us. Paul urges the Corinthians to imitate him and sends Timothy to remind them of how he acts in Christ. While it may sound rather arrogant to instruct others to be more like oneself, Paul clarifies that they should imitate him only because he seeks to imitate Christ. The author of Hebrews spends an entire chapter detailing the faith and obedience of the patriarchs, calling them a great cloud of witnesses, which should encourage us to lay aside sin and temptation and live in obedience, looking to Christ as our chief example. James uses Abraham as an example of demonstrating the truth of our faith by our actions, and Job as an example of perseverance through suffering. While Peter uses Noah and Lot as examples of righteous men staying faithful to God in the midst of pressure from an evil culture, and Balaam as an example of a man who could not resist the temptation to do what was wrong. In other words, God does consider all of life to be a spiritual activity, whether it be someone examining the lives of historical men and women less spiritual, or reading the Beatitudes, or singing the Psalms. Rather, God repeatedly uses the examples of men and women who have gone before us as inspirations or warnings for our own lives. Plutarch is keenly aware of the distinction between righteousness and unrighteousness, justice and injustice. Plutarch correctly identifies vices such as greed, anger, bribery, envy, self-centered glory-seeking, and hypocrisy. At the same time, self-sacrifice, justice, integrity, faithfulness, and generosity are virtues that both Plutarch and the Bible commend. But we do have some extra legwork to do, since there are differences between Plutarch's standards of virtue and biblical standards. Reading these biographies can still be a beneficial and even spiritual exercise, but only if we hold up these lives to the standard of Scripture, measuring their virtues and vices by God's standards rather than Plutarch's. Plutarch does not explain or list his standards of virtue in any one place. His understanding of virtue comes to light only as we read his biographies and observe what he commends and condemns. However, it would be fair to summarize the core of his idea of virtue with what have been called the four classical virtues. These are fortitude, justice, temperance, and prudence. The four classical virtues: fortitude, justice, temperance, and prudence. Fortitude is strength in trial, courage in the face of danger. Plutarch repeatedly praises Alexander and Caesar for their courage and boldness, especially in the face of overwhelming odds. He also mentions that Alexander purposely exposed himself to danger in order to encourage others to follow his example of bravery. On the other hand, one of Plutarch's few condemnations of Demosthenes is his lack of fortitude in battle. Justice was a virtue that applied to everyone, not just lawyers or judges. This virtue meant that a person treated others fairly, honestly, and in accord with what is right. Plutarch praises Alexander for performing his conquests with justice, but condemns his slaughter of the defeated Indians as the one instance of injustice in his campaign. Plutarch praises Cicero for both his justice and his prudence, claiming that Cicero fulfilled Plato's dream of a wise and just man as the ruler of a state. A man who demonstrates temperance is one who shows moderation and acts appropriately, without excess, in all circumstances. Alexander is praised for his temperance when he refused to drink the only water in the camp, since no one else would have any, and when he rebuked his soldiers for desiring excesses of pleasure over hard work. Finally, prudence refers to a man's wisdom and foresight in making decisions and in his actions. While Cicero ruled with wisdom and Alexander showed foresight in preparing for battle, the sophist Callisthenes comes under condemnation for being a powerful speaker with no judgment. In addition to these four virtues, Plutarch also praises self-sacrifice and generosity while condemning self-praise. In fact, his harshest condemnation falls on Cicero and Alexander for their own self-admiration. Plutarch believed that these virtues could and should be found in any man, regardless of his birth or education. While birth and education did benefit a man in life, virtue did not depend on circumstances, but on an ingenuous or honest nature and an industrious mind. The latter was the most important, however, for resolution and effort were the most significant factors in developing virtue. These virtues certainly don't appear contrary to Christian principles. After all, Moses told Joshua to be strong and of good courage. Micah urges God's people to do justice, and temperance is listed as one of the qualifications to be a leader in the church. The author of Proverbs repeatedly commends the prudent man. In fact, the medieval church adopted the four classical virtues as part of its summary of godly living. So, where does Plutarch go wrong? Perhaps the better question to ask is not where Plutarch goes wrong, but what happens when we go wrong. Plutarch can acknowledge virtue when he sees it, but he also has condemnations for each of the men he writes about. In the end, every biography is a mixed bag, full of warnings about mistakes and errors in each man's life. The difference between Christianity and paganism does not show up most clearly in defining virtuous actions, but in dealing with the problem of every man's lack of virtue. Even fallen men usually recognize virtue when they see it, but only the God of the Bible can provide a solution to the lack of virtue that has confronted all mankind since the fall. The biblical model of virtue, then, does not start with fortitude, justice, temperance, and prudence. Those virtues ought to characterize men and women who follow God, but they do so as a result of a fundamental change that occurs in their life as a result of meeting a person. When Paul offers his life as an example, he does so only while clarifying that his life is based on the example of Jesus Christ, who not only provides a pattern for living, but also provides a way for cleansing and forgiveness when we fail. In the end, it is a person, not a set of principles, who sets the standard for virtue. And it is only in communion with that person that we have the strength to act according to that standard and to find forgiveness when we contradict that standard. It is interesting that Hebrews 11 provides a host of examples for the classical virtues. These men and women of God displayed incredible fortitude, justice, temperance, and prudence. Yet they are not praised for their virtues per se, but for their faith. Faith becomes the test of virtue, not because the virtues don't matter, but because faith is the means by which we enter into a relationship with the person who strengthens us in action and forgives us in our failures. The medieval church did not toss out the classical virtues. Rather, they added 3 Christian virtues: faith, hope, and love, as the necessary means by which a man could achieve the other 4. In the same way, Plutarch and his biographies do not deserve to be set aside. They ought to be read, and they ought to inspire us in our actions. And they ought to be read with the understanding that a person, Jesus Christ, forges our path to virtue, not our own resolution through an ingenuous nature or an industrious mind. In addition to the classical standards of virtue and vice, Plutarch also opens a window into a world desperately searching for divine revelation. Darius marched happily to his doom despite a misinterpreted dream. Demosthenes urged Greece to attack the Macedonians against the evidence of every augury and sacrifice. But the problem wasn't stupidity, it was a lack of confidence in the information they received. The ancient mindset was wide open to divine communication, but it was held captive by the false gods of the ancient world, unable to discern what to trust or how to interpret the information they received. Alexander's last few days of his life provide us with the most pitiful picture of this desire for revelation. Battling crows, a tame donkey that attacked a lion, and visions of a crowned king all frightened Alexander and shook his confidence in both the gods and his friends. He seems unable to decide whether he should take heed of the signs or whether sufficient courage would be justification to ignore them as mere superstitions. Plutarch comments that Alexander's mind was filled with fears and follies as he sent around to various oracles for advice. In the ultimate irony, or perhaps the ultimate sign of futility for a man unable to trust his divine sources, Alexander died from a fever just after receiving a favorable answer from one of his oracles. This picture of random, confusing signs that open the mind to superstition stands in stark contrast to the God of the Bible, who has clearly revealed himself to his people throughout the ages. He revealed both his majesty and his mercy to Adam, promising a Savior who would restore the relationship between God and man. He personally spoke with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, establishing his covenant with Israel and promising future blessings through their seed. He talked face to face with Moses and wrote down his commandments with his own finger, that his people might know how to serve him. His prophets delivered his messages to the people so that they were not without a witness to his truth or his commands. But finally, and most clearly, in fulfillment of all his promises, God himself came and dwelt with men in the person of Jesus of Christ. Christ then proclaimed God's love for his people and accomplished a way of salvation through his death and resurrection. This restored the broken fellowship between God and man, so that through Christ, men might approach God's throne and speak with him, and his Spirit would communicate his will to men. In this way, God has met humanity's desire for divine revelation and restored his communion with them. The fears, follies, confusion, and misinterpretations that plagued the men of Greece and Rome fade away before the God who has sent his Son and left his word and Spirit so that we might know him and his will for our lives. And although Alexander still might not know the future as he desired, his frenzied desire to know the future becomes unnecessary before a God who has repeatedly demonstrated his sovereign faithfulness. By Christopher Walker.